cut you off
No, you're right.
and say and ask you what you would say is the difference between communism and socialism in your top 5 books. I would just say socialism is when it's the transitionary state when the workers are in control of the state. That's what I would say. Communism is, you know, a classless society that's yet to be achieved. My top 5 books. Number one, I'll just go top three. Number one, Lenin's Imperialism, because I studied geopolitics in college, and that one book from 1917 made more sense than anything I had read over the last 4 years for explaining the world. Um, the number two is just Marx's Capital. Honestly, that's my favorite book, if I'm being honest, but it's just the best. It's like Althusser has the best quote. It's like the dialectical materialism or historical materialism was just a theory, and but it became science when Marx wrote Capital or whatever, something like that. Basically, like that's the ultimate proof of historical dialectical and historical materialism. And then the last one I like is Origins, because I don't know, for me, I just like once I understood what historical materialism was, I wanted someone to go all the way back with it. Like as far back as we can possibly go. Look at anthropology and the develop of human civilization from, as far back as we can get, and that's basically what Engels does in that book. So I think it's underrated, honestly, but a useful text.
So for me, to answer the same, by the way, Capital is I mean, it's phenomenal, right? And so is I love why you like Origin so much, because that's how it is. You want to learn where everything comes from once you know that there's a science behind it. Study. But so for me, socialism and communism, I think what Eddie said is good. But I think what we really need is a materialist understanding of these things. If socialism means anything in the real world, it is what is created in the real world, right? And so the way that they used to use it back in the day when Marx and Engels were calling themselves socialists comes from the utopians. And I believe it was Robert Owen who first used the word in English. And he used it in contrast to a liberal republic, which was a society based on fulfillment of the needs of an individual or individuals in competition with each other. And he talked about why this wasn't good for him morally, right? And so he proposed a system that would benefit society itself, or a social republic, a socialist republic. And so what Marx and Engels did when they created scientific socialism, and not just them, there's August Bebel and Joseph Weydemeyer, there's a lot of people, but they said that, like coming up with these massive plans for how to organize production is all well and good, but it only gets you so far. We need to understand how this liberal society developed and how that's the society before that developed. And we need to learn the laws that society moves by in order to actually get to a system. And when we do that, we discover that a social system is not only just possible afterwards, but inevitable if society is to continue, right? So from that, socialism is just a society serving society itself. Now, in the real world, in a materialist sense, what does this mean? This means all the communist countries, right? This means the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This means China. This means Cuba. There's not a bourgeois society that can say it serves society itself. Communism, Marx uses this word a little differently in different contexts, but the only time he actually said communism is he talked about it as the movement of history, right? The actual material process of society realizing itself over time. And for him, that means that, we started in one community, or what they usually call primitive communism, and will return to a community on a higher stage of development. So, communism, therefore, is this process of history happening and achieving this overcoming of alienation through property and production becoming itself in its fully realized form, which we can only understand in its entirety after its actualization. And when it comes to books, I'll be quick because, like Eddie said, I'm a windbag and I ramble. I'm going to go with Strategy for a Black Agenda by Henry Winston, which is not just for Black people, I promise you. It's an agenda for everyone. But that one, let's see. I'm going to say Capital as well, because that's just fantastic. And Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 4. 4 is a weird one because it's early, but I love it.
Those are some interesting picks for top 5. I like it.
Well, I only did 3 because you did 3. So,
or top 3, yeah.
I'm looking at Dialectical Logic by Ilyenkov, and I don't know. Probably the Stalin book.
History of the Communist Party of the
Soviet Union. Short course. Yeah.
No, okay. I'll tackle the books one first. It's a very hard question. I would say that my top 3, something from Hegel. I want to cheat and say the lectures on the history of philosophy. I'm a nerd when it comes to the history of philosophy. I love reading about the history of philosophy from the philosophers that I love the most. So lectures on the history of philosophy, which is usually printed as 3 volumes.
I'm going to keep showing them.
I got that one too.
Dialectical Logic from Ilyenkov as well, because it does the same thing. It goes through the history of philosophy from a dialectical materialist point of view. And the third one, I haven't had Marx, Engels, or Lenin on the list yet, but I'll go with a double pick of Marx's Grundrisse, simply because it's I don't want to be like the archetypical scholar that's picking, the nice big book that it's the reason why I would pick the Grundrisse is because it's a nice midpoint between a Marx that's beginning to refine his knowledge of economics to a point where, like, within a year he publishes a contribution to the critique of political economy, and within 8 years he publishes Capital. But he's also embedded in philosophy a whole lot more than his writing will be in. It's not that his writing wasn't embedded, it's that he's tackling philosophical questions directly in the Grundrisse. So it's reading the Grundrisse is like getting the best of getting Capital and the manuscripts of 1844 together. So it's a very comprehensive Marx. And then I would say the Lenin's volume 38, because that's known as the Philosophical Notebooks, where he's reading again the history of philosophy and making comments on it. So by saying that book, that means that I also include all the books that he's reading through, because in order to read that book properly, you have to read it with those. So a little bit of cheating, but oh well.
Sorry, I was going to ask if you gave the difference between socialism and communism, but were you not done with the top books?
Okay. We have a fellow windbag here.
You guys can talk as long as you want. I actually just had to pee.
But what's interesting, in China, they're developing the theory of the 3 stages. And the earliest stage, they depict that it looks a certain way, has a certain amount of private ownership of capital. The second stage has a more public ownership. It's abolished the small area of control that capital had. And then the third stage is formally known as what Marx would have called what Marx calls in the Critique of the Gotha program, the higher stage of communism, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Again, another framework that Marx provides is the lower stage, being the stage of socialism, of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There exists a condition where classes haven't been fully abolished, but the proletariat is in control, and their task is to solidify that control, to strengthen the state so that it is able to repress the elements of the old order that want the old order back, to repress those in between elements that have lingering ideology from the old order. And that dictatorship of the proletariat stage is thought of as socialism. He uses the lower stage of communism to describe it. It's got the birthmarks of capitalist society as well, one of which is still having a state, which is a feature of class societies in general. A state exists so that one class can oppress another. The difference is that under socialism, it's the working class, the vast majority of people, 99% of the people in a given society, who oppress the 1% that in the previous order was the one that oppressed everyone else and exploited everyone. So that would be the lower stage. The higher stage would be communism, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Again, thinking about labor in this way that we talked about it earlier in the stream, as something that's as a sort of activity that is inextricably linked with the concept of flourishing for human beings, with the concept in Greek, the telos, the end, the highest good for human beings is that form of creative work that we can endeavor only fully under a socialist society. I think that maybe the three-stage idea is more correct today, because of the realization that after socialism took root in 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, it didn't just explode and take root everywhere else, that it still has a monster called capitalism in its imperialist stage that it has to fight against, and that a lot of the ideals that we strive towards, we need to see them as ends that we're fighting towards, but not as ways of judging socialist societies of whether they're worthy of our support or not. Doing so is a participation in what I call the purity fetish, having this pure marker, this pure idea that you use as a way to judge stuff that's in the actual world. So I think something like a three-stage tier would be appropriate in order to think about that, how that first stage that Marx wasn't really able to foretell, how it's a little bit more complicated than how he describes the lower stage of communism in Critique of the Gotha program.
I have a question for Carlos or Noah, whoever wants to answer, and maybe it applies a little bit to what you said, Carlos, about the Grundrisse being when Marx really starts to study economics. And, you see, like, we don't necessarily agree with Althusser, says there's two different Marxes, but there's definitely a development in Marx's thinking, as he gets older. His thought starts to change and become more refined. So is there not something in one of his earlier writings that says, like, the workers take power and then, that's communism, or the workers take power, nationalize everything, and then we've entered, communism period, with less talk about dictatorship of the proletariat in this transitionary stage? Because I think I've heard that before. So even if that's not something Marx says, I think it's a misconception that's out there.
Is it referring to when he's talking about, so there's in one of the prefaces, or maybe it's the afterword to the manifesto, he's talking about the workers take power and they wrest by degree all capital from the hands of the bourgeoisie. And people, the sort of anti-communist leftists, will use the fact that, say, there is capital in hands of the new class in China to say they're not real socialism, because, they didn't do what Marx said to do. But they're fundamentally missing what Marx meant.
By degree is the key.
Right. First, they're completely missing the words by degree. Second, they're thinking Marx is writing an instruction manual for them rather than making a deduction of what he thinks is going to happen.
Right.
Marx would be the first one to say, like, if something doesn't happen the way I think it will, then I'm going to change my thinking to correct for whatever error I made that led me to that deduction. So people want to read him like he's a prophet. He wasn't a prophet. He was a scientist. I think if it's that thing from the manifesto. Also,
I think it is from the manifesto. Some people have used Critique of the Gotha program to say that, but usually anarchists who then say, like, therefore China isn't real communism,
Oh, Noah I think
Oh, we
his
lost Noah.
signal went out. But yeah, I think it might be that quote from the manifesto again. Marx was expecting, or at least he felt like he wasn't expecting anything. Again, it's a science, and he understood what he was doing as a science, and that you couldn't like predict too much. You could just see general tendencies. But the tendency that he was expecting to occur was that if socialism takes place in one place, it's going to end up blowing up and taking place everywhere else. Um, Early on, he felt like that first place that it was going to take place in was the more developed capitalist societies, industrial societies of Western Europe. As he continues to study people like Henry Louis Morgan, like Maxim Kovalevsky, as he studies the anthropologist of his time, the leading anthropologist, as he follows the Russian communes and the debates of the Russian left populists, the socialists, he changes his mind about whether it's bound to be Western Europe, the first one to take root in. Unfortunately, this change of mind never really happened in a format that he published. So it's something that we know now because of the things that have been since published well after his death, with the exception of the Russian preface to the manifesto, which was published late in his life, and in which he mentions the potential of the Russian Obshchina, the Russian commune, being potentially a vessel for revolution. But the the point that Noah's making is exactly right, and it gets at the heart of a phrase that Lenin was constantly repeating, which is that Marxism is not a lifeless dogma; it's a living guide to action, and that's how we have to think about the Marxist texts. It's if reality doesn't reflect some of the things that are said in the text itself would urge you to change because what matters is the worldview, the method, not the conclusions that are derived at 150 years ago.
Mm. It's interesting too that Marx starts to look at neo-colonialism or imperialism more towards the end of his life, and that's like the last chapter of Capital. It's called like the modern analysis of colonialism, and he thought socialism would explode everywhere, kind of expected it to, which obviously has been halted primarily by imperialism and colonialism, which is also why I think Lenin's analysis of imperialism is so groundbreaking and so necessary and worth reading.